So I hope you won't be put off this morning by a little emotional display. We've got some anger in this gospel. We've got some mercy in this gospel. We've got the complexity of human relationships, a complexity that reflects our own struggle at times with how we regard our own situations versus how we regard the situations of other people. And it's simple for Jesus to say, love your neighbor as yourself. And that sounds really good. And that's something that is worthy to aspire to. But when we really are faced with the challenge of putting that into practice, how do I regard myself? How do I have understanding and grace and compassion and patience for my own foibles versus how do I have those things for somebody else who's irritating me, who's really ticking me off? That love your neighbor as yourself thing is challenging. And it is a lot easier to assume from our own point of view the motives of the other, especially when they are really irking us, that those motives aren't really deserving of patience or understanding. They're just irritating. And so in this narrative, we have this initial impulse of less patience, a debt situation. And I'm going to ask you to remember back to the historical circumstances when there was no such thing as declaring bankruptcy, when there was no such thing as calling up your credit card company and saying, oh, I didn't make that charge, I'm not responsible for it. When there was no such thing as the consumer protections that we have in place right now that would prevent a person from, on account of financial obligations that they had, from being thrown into prison. You've read about this, you know about this, you've heard about debtor's prison, but we don't have this explicitly anymore. We could argue that maybe in the criminal justice system there's not exactly the same standard for the poor versus the wealthy, but that's a separate sermon for a separate day. This particular gospel narrative is about a king who has someone come to him who has an enormous debt. 10,000 talents. We need to translate that because we don't use talents anymore as a unit of monetary exchange. So a talent would have been roughly the equivalent of 1 day's wage for an average laborer. So whatever it is that's your 1 day's wage, or whatever it is that you on average spend to sustain your lifestyle, 10,000 of those. 10,000 of those. Good luck ever getting out of that debt if that's what you owed. And he comes, and he is required to pay the whole darn thing. Remember the mortgage crisis when the adjustable rate mortgages adjusted and there was this giant balloon payment that was all of a sudden due, and how many people were in the thick soup because of that? That's what's happening here, but multiply that by a factor. Pay it all at once. And the guy is just desperate. He's panicked. He understands the consequences for not being able to meet this obligation. And he pleads, as you and I might do. So here's where love your neighbor as yourself, really the rubber meets the road, right? What does the holder of the debt do with that? So you say, oh, another deadbeat. You know, you should have planned better. Should have been more financially responsible. You should have seen that your resources would not be able to meet your obligations and not gotten yourself into this situation. You did this to yourself. People react that way, right? Not my problem. That's your problem. But he got a different reaction. The reaction he got was compassion. The reaction he got was mercy. You quickly can imagine who the roles are analogous to in this gospel narrative. So he goes away. And he meets somebody else. And isn't it often the case, don't we often get humbled, where we find ourselves in a certain situation, we have a particular reaction, somebody else responds to us, and then we're in that parallel situation, but the roles are reversed. The shoe is on the other foot. And that's what happens to him. And he has somebody who owes him. But it's not 10,000 talents, it's 100 denarii. It's peanuts. It's not going to make a difference in anything. And he gets really angry. His attitude is, not my problem. Pay what you owe, or I'm going to hand you over to be imprisoned. He's not inclined towards compassion. He's got an emotional response that is harsh. And he says, listen, a debt is a debt, and you're going to settle it with me. Love your neighbor as yourself. Treat the person on the road who cuts you off with the same kind of grace that you would like to be treated if you cut somebody else off, but then they honk at you, and you go, come on, relax, buddy. I just got to get off on that exit over there. But when the person does it to me, I don't care where you're going, you jerk. Love your neighbor as yourself. The person who just talks and talks and talks and talks your ear off and seems to not have much social skills, and you think, oh my gosh, are you serious? You know, can you do a little give and take in this conversation? But then we're in a situation where something happens to us and we walk into a room and other people are talking and we go, you'll never guess, I have to tell you this. And they're all supposed to just drop everything and listen because what I have to say is important. That other person was just a bore. They're just obnoxious. They're irritating. But me, I have significant things to say, so listen to me. And we can go on and on and on. It's not about money. It's not about the relationship between a king and a slave. It's not about debt. It's about the way in which we interact with one another in the situations of life where we come into friction. And whether love your neighbor as yourself really is a way that we can live, or whether it's just aspirational sounding words from a religious guy a couple of thousand years ago that don't really apply in real life. And that's the challenge of this narrative. And you remember the end of the story. He goes back, and the guy who forgave him, the person in the position of authority, the king who forgave him, hears about this hypocrisy, and he goes, what are you about? Seriously? And every once in a while, we have a friend, somebody who cares about us, enough to be able to say that to us. Really? That's what you said? That's the way that you acted? Wow. I think you're better than that. And while that might sound offensive, some people might go, don't judge me. That's a good friend. That's somebody who's able to say, wait a minute, let's take a step back. What is this all about? What are we doing here? What do you want from that relationship? What did that trigger in you? What's your part in that? And is there any room for all of those things that we are inclined to do for ourselves? Patience and compassion and understanding. All of those things that we find it easier usually to be able to summon for our own circumstances and our own foibles and our own ways of slipping up, are those as readily available in the interactions that we have with other people in which there's friction and irritation. So, I'm never going to be in a situation where somebody else owes me 10,000 daily wages. I pray that I'm never in a situation where I owe somebody else 10,000 daily wages. That would be scary. I'm never going to be in a situation where I'm threatened because of financial obligation with being sent to debtor's prison. We don't live in that society anymore. But I am in a situation, and you are too, if not on a daily basis, on a weekly basis and beyond, of having opportunities to interact with somebody else who does something that irritates you, and to stop for a second and think, what does it mean right now to love my neighbor as myself? What does it cost me? And what does it do for this other person and the relationship that I have with them? And do I want to have any relationship with them? Do they mean anything with me? Or do I just hit them with a zinger because it feels good in the moment and because I'm irked? And this kind of gospel narrative presents all kinds of possibilities for reflection, not about the literal interaction of the characters as we hear the story told, but about the ways in which it builds bridges to our own life and the broader human experience. There's a joke about riding the bus. I don't know if you've ever heard this joke before. It's a little bit harsh. But it says, when you ride the bus, there's always at least one weirdo on the bus. And then the joke teller says, I could never tell who that person is. When we're out in the world, there's always somebody who's just not quite on their A game, who's maybe distracted, who's maybe just doesn't have the same experiences of courtesy or interaction or socialization or culture or whatever it is. And they say something or do something and you go, huh, really? And sometimes that person's you. And sometimes that person's me. And I am so grateful throughout my life when I have been surrounded by people who have given me grace, even if not strictly deserved, because I was a little bit out of my depth, or I was a little bit out of line, or I was just a little bit off that day. And if we can be the people who are offering and extending that grace, then we can be the people who embody love your neighbor as yourself. Amen.